Right. I'm actually starting off, I'm looking, I wrote this the other day. This ended up becoming one of those things, and I thought, oh, this is a nice idea for a talk. And then I started going back over my last 20 years, and it became a bit painful, and the drinking started, and there was lots of stuff I'm not going to go through because it was just too awful to relive. But I thought it's one of these things that we don't talk about our failures enough. We talk about the things that we were successful at, which is great. We talk about the things that we've done and the outcomes, and it's all fabulous. But the thing is, half the time we have to learn through failing. And it's the best way of learning, and particularly when you're dealing with stuff where there is no precedent. And so if you don't know me, I was at BBC for 20 years, actually. I was head of digital accessibility for 18 of those years, so I actually set up the accessibility team there, the digital accessibility team. I won't claim accessibility at the BBC. It goes back 100 years, because the BBC started out as an employment scheme for soldiers coming back from World War I, and there were lots of people with limb differences, PTSD. Even the first Director General was severely vision impaired from gunshot wound to the face. He had one eye and the other one didn't work very well. And they brought all these engineers back to create the technologies to build the world's first national radio network. And that's what the BBC was all about to start with. And then they put peacetime services on military technology. It's a fascinating thing. They invented closed caption subtitling the year I was born in 1969. They invented in-vision signing in the early 1950s, set up wirelesses for the blind in the late 1920s, and invented audio description in the 90s as well, or at least all of the production tools for it. So they had this fabulous long history. I just turned up because no one had I was already there as a brand manager, and I'd come in through design routes, and I wasn't actually a brand manager particularly. I did some brand management stuff, but I was running a creative team, got into a discussion about it. No one had a plan around digital accessibility, and everyone said that they wanted to do it right at the board level, and there was no approach, and it somehow ended up as my job. So I was also the head of UX design as well as accessibility for 12 of those years, because I also set up design research. I have dyslexia, ADHD, other neurodivergent stuff that I've never bothered to explore, and I am an assistive technology user. I am bald. I always think that's a demographic that ever gets forgotten. There's lots of useless demographics out there, and I've always have a struggle with my brand manager side and my UX side as we talk about different things as far as audiences are concerned. Brand managers, it's all about emotion, the way people feel about things, the way their experiences are, how loyal they feel to a thing, what their satisfaction was. They don't care about function. And in UX, we think about function, where people are able to complete things, where people are able to do stuff, and so I'm always sort of wrestling those two things in my head. So I'm actually going to start off by saying some of the things we did do, and then talk about the pain that caused them. So we parted company with WCAG in 2006 and wrote our own guidelines. I think this is Stockholm syndrome. I'm still saying we. I left there 2.5 years ago. But we did in those days. Always struggled with WCAG because WCAG is written by consultants for consultants. And academics. There's virtually no people who build things actually involved in it, and there was a running joke for years that no designers were harmed in the making of WCAG, and I think that's still pretty much true. So we ended up writing our own guidelines based on outcomes. So we would build things, test them, get data, understand it, research stuff, and then capture as guidelines, whereas they get in a room, it's consensus, they capture it and then tell people what to do. I prefer being retrospective and have evidence-based. Built the first mobile accessibility guidelines in 2010, because we had the Olympics turning up, and the board told us that we've got to redo all of the apps to be accessible. All of the mobile web experience has to be accessible before the Olympics. And we weren't going to wait for another 7 years for WCAG to get their act in order, and they still haven't done native applications. So we wrote our own. I'm mad about fonts. So BBC Reef is one of the things I'm really, really proud of working on. Font accessibility, I will nerd out. Don't talk to me about it unless you've got at least an hour spare, because it just is never-ending stream. I was part of the accessibility team, started in iPlayer in 2004, which is when we started building the first prototype, because the board said it has to be accessible from launch, not only the world's first long-form VOD service, but it has to be more accessible than television. And that was there, and so we had to do everything. We found stuff out there, and then we could then show the rest of the organisation what we'd done, which is a great thing. I think, it's been touched on already. You discover things in places and share. And UView is another thing. So we built the first accessible TV platform as well, which is great. And other stuff. I've always done other stuff. I have to have so many projects going on. It's my ADHD thing. If I've not got 18 things to do, I can't concentrate on one. So Champions of Accessibility Network, I was just running a panel for this just before this event. Fabulous. Come and find us on LinkedIn. We're a group. If you want part of cultural change to happen within your organisation, this is what we try and focus on within this group. We've got 1,600 members of people in various organisations around the world trying to think about accessibility as cultural change, not about compliance. Gamesaccessibilityguidelines.com is another thing that I co-authored many, many years ago, because BBC was the first ever games publisher to do games accessibility, and we wrote the first guidelines. But I'm going to talk about things that I may be ashamed of. This is actually in a WCAG working group. I have been to them. And this is Mr. Lion. If you ever come across Jamie Knight with a K, Jamie and Lion, this is one of the rare occasions that Lion leapt on me during a meeting and that photograph was taken. And we just look like we've just been discovered. I love that photo. But I'm going to talk about the kind of things that I really kind of look back on going, what the hell was I thinking? But there were always reasons. So let's start with overlays, which everyone in accessibility world loves to hate. And I built 3, or at least I was the product owner of 3 at the BBC. And this is the oldest one, which was Betsy, which actually predates my job there. It was a developer that had built this in education, and we ended up running it across the entire site. Back in those days, the estate of the BBC was so broken, we couldn't find, everything was tables-based layouts. We couldn't find markup that was the same on 2 different pages. It was mess. There were, how many was it? 78 different media players that they'd built bespoke. I mean, they really needed awards for the amount of duplication. Everyone just built 1,000 flowers bloom. It was a nightmare. And so we ended up having to build 3 different technologies that would try and fix pages. There was always a text-only link. You'd hit it and it would do stuff. Betsy was brilliant. Now, Betsy, we kept going for years, even though everyone stopped using it for an accessibility reason, is because it got us into China. Because it was built in Perl script and created these huge long Perl script URLs that then people were sharing, and the Chinese government couldn't block, and we could get BBC News into places around the world via an accessibility technology. So I just didn't switch it off, even though it was just like, no, let's leave it going. And then eventually we moved the whole of the news onto the dark web and got around it that way, and bye-bye Betsy. But the thing is, with these kind of technologies, sometimes you just sit there and go, for a temporary bit, for a stopgap, what can I do to just make a little bit of an improvement? And I've got a mess. And this is why I always struggle with having a go at overlays, because overlays do some things really, really well, and accessibility isn't one of them. But they do one thing that is really good, is they've brought thousands of organisations to the accessibility table for the first time, who never did anything before. They don't go for organisations that have programs. Thousands and thousands of companies and organisations now have these damn things, and at least they're now thinking about it. They may not be doing the right thing, but it's now on their agenda, and which is why I can never complain about these. This is the person, Carol Beer from Little Britain. Little Britain, no one talks about Little Britain anymore. But Computer Says No, and WCAG Says No. My daughter actually made that for me many years ago and sent it to me. This is the person you never want to be, and this was me, although it was the BBC guidelines at the time. When I started out, you start out with these great intentions and you want to make change, and you start becoming the accessibility police. This was at a conference. There was a CIA at a conference. I was like, please. And I absolutely loved sitting on there, and I thought this was a really great thing, because we were the accessibility police at the BBC. We were walking around everywhere, telling everyone how to do their job, and not really understanding 3/4 of what they did, which kind of turned you into this guy. And by the way, has anyone got a vision impairment? I should have checked at the beginning, because I should be already describing the slides. If you have, raise your hand if you've got vision impairment. Good, I won't. So this was Steve Faulkner made me this years ago, who was mentioned in the last presentation wrongly about the accessibility lipstick. But Steve Faulkner's a real old timer around accessibility. And this is basically was me. I was that person that you walk into a room and everyone go, oh, Jesus, he's back. And what have we done? And what do we need to do? And even if you were there being friendly, we used to audit, we used to police. And this is something I got massively wrong, was policing. Because when you police, people will do what it takes to make you go away. They will not do what it takes to make change. You can't push cultural change by rocking up. And accessibility people have to try and do everything. You have to be a design researcher, you've got to be a designer, you've got to be a developer, you've got to be a tester, you've got to be a product owner, you've got to understand the whole thing. But you don't really understand it as much as the people who do it. But you understand it enough to give an opinion. And this was the worst me. And this is the problem. And it was because I got it wrong, because I misunderstood the difference between guidelines and design. And guidelines are not design. I like to call it legal experience design, not user experience design. And legal experience design is standards and guidelines, accessibility standards and guidelines, because they're checklists. If checklists worked, let's fire all the designers and replace them with checklists. But they don't work. You can't have design for one group of people and a checklist for another. That's segregation. And if anything, that's actually kind of ableist. It's an odd thing. They get guidelines, they get designed experiences. That's not a great way of dealing with things. It's very good for keeping a compliance officer happy, which is why it's legal experience design. But it doesn't work within an organization. And it took me several years to work this one out, because we were trying to do this at scale, and it wasn't working as well as we needed it to scale. And we realized at that point we had to do something different. Now, to understand how we learnt and where we were failing around this, you have to understand that the problem with, and this is that whole thing about demographics, I knew there was a tie in there somewhere, is that WCAG is a thing called, it has a medical model of accessibility behind it. It's all based around American law. And it's all based around the weighting of different disabled groups within American law. And it's mostly written by Americans, surprise, surprise, mostly American consultancies. And they think about the American legal system, which is weighted unfairly against different disability groups. The problem is if you think about that and you think, what do blind people need, what do deaf people need, designers don't think about that. Well, a brand manager might, because they are a cultural group. They are a determined group that you can turn around and sit and talk to them as a group of identity within that group. But actually, when you talk to designers about it, they go, yeah. What do they need? Because they get straight into needs. What are their preferences? What are their coping strategies? They start talking about behaviors. And when you start shifting the conversation from medical model to a thing called social model of disability, you understand that it's not about conditions, it's about needs and preferences. And these are intersectional. We all have needs and we all have preferences. Our needs, if they are not met, create barriers. Our preferences are our coping strategies. They're the things that we've learned over our years. And the social model of disability is incredibly useful for understanding this, because it says people have impairments. I've got vision impairment here. So I've got assistive technology on my face. And we often don't think about these as the oldest assistive technology, but it is. And without it, I know you're out there. There you are. No, I'm not quite that bad, but it's getting worse with age. But it says everyone has impairments, and these may also be temporary impairments. We were talking about Diageo a minute ago. And Diageo, I've done 2 years work with them because they have a disabling product. You know, the more Guinness you drink, the more disabled you become. Cognitively and motor particularly. And we were talking about these and just saying, right, let's build applications for use in pubs, and we have to test with drunk people. But let's test with people who also have motor disabilities all the time, because they will tell us more about the coping strategies and things that we should support, bring in lived experience and creates better for everyone. But impairment plus environment. So if an environment has not been designed to cater for an impairment, that is when disability happens. It's a design choice. So no one is disabled until someone designs something that someone can't use, is the way that it looks at. It's not about disability as identity, it's about disability as experience. And this is a much more useful way of thinking about this from design point of view. This goes back a long way. Dieter Rams, that everyone who's a designer should know, wrote the 10 Principles of Good Product Design, which is still as relevant today as they were in the early 1970s when he wrote them, late 1960s. Absolutely brilliant. But he's one of my favourite quotes around this is indifference towards people and the reality in which they live is actually the one and only cardinal sin in design, and our needs and our preferences are our emotional and functional realities. You know, and this is always been there. And this is one of those places where we got it massively wrong. Absolutely massive. I've got a list of them. This is one of the least painful ones to go down, which was BBC Microbit, which was a brilliant idea to create a credit side card computer that we can give to every child. Fabulous idea, absolutely brilliant. We set partnerships up mostly with Microsoft R&D, but the actual design of the computer came out for BBC R&D. And they were supposed to then do the developer environments. And we had everything in at the beginning, and we said, yeah, and the contracts and everything around the accessibility is all in there. We couldn't work on everything continuously. We took our eye off the ball off this for 8 months, but we went, no, because we've contractually done this, we've talked about it, they'll deal with it. We came back 8 months later, nothing had happened, and all sorts of decisions had been made. And we suddenly realized that they hadn't considered that any child could be disabled. And we were like, there are disabled kids? And they were like, yeah, but they're not going to use this. And I was like, why not? Well, how does a blind child write code? And I was like, I'm going to introduce you to some blind developers. I know plenty of them. Okay, their environments that they're building in are terrible, and they get around it. But what? And even Microsoft, they'd completely forgotten about the developer environments. They completely, even there's a light on this that you can tell the status of it, and it's red and green, so it's not colorblind friendly, and it was a complete mess. And we ended up having to hijack a pin. The other thing is it only outputs pictures, not text. It outputs pictures of text, not text. And we're like, well, how the hell are we going to get an assistive technology that needs to speak to recognize a picture? So now I've got to build a JavaScript thing in the middle of it that will then look at the image of the text and turn it back into text because you've messed it up. And it was an absolute nightmare. It's still not right years later. It was such a huge missed opportunity. And we ended up having, I mean, this is when you have those huge rows, and me coming from a marketing background, I said, we just have to change everything and just say it's not for every child, because you've just said it's not for them, and you've made that decision. It was a design decision to exclude. And even if it wasn't conscious, it happened, and that was a massive problem. God, I always wish that was much better. Anyway. Why am I talking about needs, preferences, and outcomes? So I've talked about needs and preferences. The thing is, if you then think about those and change the thinking to needs and preferences, you can then measure outcomes. Outcomes are something that WCAG is not very good at. It sort of talks about them. I mean, it's an interesting thing. It's a thing that tells you, well, it actually tells you how to test something. It doesn't tell you how to build it. You have to then try and augment. That's why you have accessibility people who take all of this confusing stuff and try and turn it into something useful. And then you put it into design systems and processes, etc. And then I never used to send anyone to the guidelines unless I didn't like them. That was a regular thing. And then they would realize why I'm sending them there, because no one understands them. They're a horrible thing. And the thing that we would change was change it and turn around and say, right, we need to consider everyone's needs and preferences. We need to measure outcomes. It's an interesting one because they have the 4 principles, don't they? Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Only one of them you can actually test using the guidelines, which is robust. Perceivable, operable, and understandable, only a person can tell you whether that happened. A guideline, a checklist can't. It can tell you what it probably might happen, but it can never tell you if it did, which is a massive problem. There's also a missing guideline in there, which is fun. Because when they were written in the 1990s, they were thinking about American government websites, which are not fun. Now we go, it's a cultural destination. We go shopping, we interact with people, we do fun things now on the internet. It's a different destination as it was then, you know, and we're all doing that. If you don't do fun, if you don't do engaging or satisfying, if you don't have an emotional outcome off it, it doesn't matter how perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust it is, they're not coming back. You know, it has to be about what was intended. People go to Miro to collaborate. I've done work with Miro. I helped them set up their accessibility team a couple of years ago. And And we just said, this is that whole thing. If people don't think about it as guidelines, shove the guidelines out the way. We have to turn around and say, everyone needs to be able to go in there, have a voice, collaborate, be part of the process. If you're not achieving that, it doesn't matter how technically accessible or not it is, it's failing as a product. So it gives us a better insight to what we need into people, which is great. So we have qualitative research, better assumptions we get without that, and then we end up with better outcomes. But then we need to measure those outcomes with quant data to feed back into the insights. There's a loop always within this. I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to go through 3 different sections of this. I don't know how much time I've got left. I've been whittering on quite a lot. Am I okay? Loads. Fabulous. So this was 2005 thinking at the BBC pretty much. Shape, build, run. We were all waterfall. It was all about the waterfall. And it still is. It's still watergile. I don't know what to call it, but who does actual agile these days? I'm not sure if it ever will happen. Sort of happens. It's nice. But the thing is, this is a really familiar process. Everyone knows this stuff. And what we would do is we would tell the teams that you've got to have a look at our guidelines. Okay, don't look at the WCAG ones. Look at ours because they tell you how to do it. They just tell you how to test it. And then we're going to come along and audit the living daylights out of you at the end, which is always, because I always felt rude doing that. I mean, it's a rude word, isn't it? I'm coming to audit you. It's not a nice word. And, if people turn up and audit you, you go, you're right. It's an unpleasant word. And the problem with that, we would then try and do training. We might get an hour's worth of 20% of the team and half of them are thinking about their job and we can't cover everything that they need. So you can't really, and they've forgotten it anyway within 3 or 4 weeks. They might take away 1 or 2 things. And then we would get into remediation cycles and 3,000 bugs in the backlog. And you're just not on top of the problem. You're just creating a problem within it and not fixing it. We actually did an audit of time. We worked out about 30% of the product effort was going to try and deal with the backlog we were creating. 30%. And when you start looking at, 300 designers, God knows how many developers and testers, etc. at the BBC, it goes into the millions that you're blowing on this and we weren't getting on top of the problem. This is not working. And so we changed our thinking. We changed up our thinking. We changed to the mobile first accessibility guidelines. We then started working on the global experience language. It used to be called global visual language before that. And then, so this was a little bit later. Glow, we had our own JavaScript library, which was completely accessible, an amazing team that was building it. And why the hell have I got, oh yeah, of course, yeah, we got Orb as well, which was originally called Barlesque, which was an accessibility project, which was to build a templating system for the whole of the BBC. So everyone already got global navigation on every single page that's accessible, search is accessible, all the skip links, all sorts of stuff are built in, so you never need a guideline, no one ever needs to build them, they just turn up as product. And this was brilliant. And so this was our 2008 to 14 thinking. And so we also brought in the first ever Champions Network it was about 2010. I saw Yahoo doing Champions Networks for things like JavaScript development and QA and all sorts of stuff. They didn't have an accessibility one. So I'm going to nick that idea and do it for Champs for Accessibility. Thank you, Yahoo. And in Yahoo, everyone had a T-shirt and it had what they did. And so you could almost, it was like your CV that you wore. And then if you were wearing the T-shirt, someone can come up and have a chat to you about the subject that you're a champion of, which is a lovely idea. And so we brought that in as this ideas thinking. We just said that all you have to do is one thing and just make sure it's discussed in every sprint that you're in. Don't let it get deferred. And if it is going to get deferred, give us a call. Or if they don't know the answer to something, bring us in, tell us you've got a problem, and we'll parachute in and help. We put everything into the design system, and because we were doing then design research as well, we were then building all of this lovely sort of user research data and accessibility coming together. We knew that everything that was going into the design system could be built accessibly. But we were still doing guidelines review, design system review within that. Still remediation was happening all over the place. This was not shift left enough despite that framework. Still, when we looked into it, 20% of our engineering effort was disappearing down the remediation rabbit hole, and we were not getting. We were doing it, but it was hard. And when people talk about accessibility hard, this is hard, and it's unnecessarily hard. I'd been off UView then for 18 months to help with the system. And I came back and that had disappeared. And it was one of those things, it was like, where's the Glow team? And they went, well, because there was someone sat in my place for 18 months while I was away. I came back and I was like, where's the Glow team? I never managed the Glow team. It was a guy called Jake Archibald who created it. It was an amazing team of engineers. And they went, they've removed it because we got this new senior management in who's come in from Yahoo again. And he went, oh, sod that. We don't need our own JavaScript library that's accessible. We've got jQuery. And that team resigned, all apart from 3 people. And that was it. And we ended up with bloody jQuery, which was an absolute dog's dinner as far as accessibility was concerned, and always was. And suddenly I had a massive hole. It was like, how the hell are we going to deal with this? So yeah, we had jQuery. I was very unhappy. Very unhappy. And so we ended up sitting down and thinking about all of this and just said, right, we need the whole thing. That was all wrong. We need the whole thing to be really, really simple. And we ended up with this sort of 3 things. This 3-step. And this is obvious. This is just so damn obvious. At the beginning of it, this was an afternoon's work, I think, of just sitting down and going, oh, how do we do this? And as long as we agreed design and QA success criteria at the start and track it, we can deal with things. I've never understood why everyone focuses on developers as far as accessibility, because to me, they're the last people you talk to. Because the designers if you don't get it right in UX, then they can't do their job. They're not going to be able to fix it. And also, sometimes the designers are not making design decisions. Ian Pouncey is another person I work with, is wonderful from back in the day. Bloody Yahoo as well. He was principal developer for Yahoo homepage, joined the BBC, ended up working for me. And he's now at Tetralogical and AliQuest, which I work at as well. He said one thing just once, and I always loved it. He said, you've got to remember that HTML is screen reader UX. It has to be designed. The design sits within the structure of it. It designs within the behavior of it. And we were like, yeah, we're not designing the code, and we should be. Those decisions should be made by designers. No developers should ever make a design decision. And if you then align what the designers are saying they want to happen with QA testing to make sure it's happened, and then you support with the right materials in the middle, you find the developers do their job. Developers just want to be developers. They don't want to be accessibility specialists. Designers just want to be designers, and QA people just want to be QA people. Mostly, 99.9% of them don't want to do a bad thing. You get the occasional interesting person. We used to call them special flowers, who just don't care about anyone. But they were very, very rare. But mostly they don't have the thing they need at the time that they need it. It's the dark art of accessibility is the problem. So we were going to do that, support with implementation guidance and examples and tests, and not code. We're not going to give anyone the code, but we're going to show you how your code should behave and report the outcomes as part of project management process. Definition of done is something that's so hard in this. If you give project managers what the outcome should be, you'll find they'll track it. If you give them the tests that will tell them that. Half the time someone says WCAG and gives them to them, they look at it and just go, I'm not dealing with that. It's a nightmare. How do I put that in context? I have to learn the whole thing and put it in context of every ticket. Who's going to do that for me? And so they descope it, they defer it. They say defer, it's always descope. And I don't blame them because it's an unfair ask. So we ended up with something very, very different. Was dealing with design deliverables and QA success criteria before a line of code is written, before design even starts. It all happens in that. We used to have this lovely little workshop we used to do called Who Are We Willing to Exclude? And we'd actually write down a list of everyone we're not designing for at the beginning with the entire team. All of us in a room, marketeers, the lot, we're in a room, big piece of paper, and then we go, right, brilliant, you're the news team. Who we were? No one ever wanted to go first. And then we go, come on, are we designing for the under 5s? And they go, no, brilliant, small children. That's not for a news app. And, this is a UK only based thing. So great, it's geo-locked. We're no one with a VPN. It's in the charter, it says only native British languages is in the charter for British services. And Polish is the second most spoken language in the UK, but the BBC doesn't do Polish because it can't, because it's not in the Royal Charter. It says the 4 native British languages, spoken and written English, Welsh, Gaelic, and British Sign Language. It's a charter thing as culture. So we can't design for Polish speakers. We're not going to block translation, but we're not designing for it. So you deal with that. And then you bring things in that you need. You know, project managers then start managing this because you tell them what the definition of done is based on your criteria. Champions become the go-to person around this to make sure the conversation's happening. We give them implementation guidelines which are atomic. They tell you, and I'll give a quick example of that in a minute, but we also define the tests for the QA people. Because again, QA is looking at WCAG going, oh, I've got to somehow try and translate that into my test framework. It's a nightmare. I don't have the time. They'll pick out bits, and they'll usually use automated testing tools, and I can do you a whole presentation about why that's a bad idea, because they don't work. But then, so we ended up building this, GEL technical documentation. There was a mirror of the design system for developers, but written for developers. Developers don't go to design systems. They're for designers. They go to where they go. But everything that's in there tells you it, and we split it into 2 things. Also, I'm going to skip past this. We'd split it into 2 things. I'm going to go past this. So just for brevity's sake, there's 2 sides of it. There's patterns and practices. So patterns could be anything. They're components. They're whatever. They could be anything from a button to a carousel, to a modal, etc. They're things that we know. There's probably about 80 or 90 patterns in total across all design systems in the world. Very rarely does something new. Usually they're hybrids of these things, but we know things about accordions. So nowhere in WCAG tells you how to do an accessible accordion. You're supposed to figure it out off all of the stuff. Whereas if you had a single document that tells you everything there is to know from a designer's point of view, the bit on design, everything about accessible accordion design, the approaches and methodologies that you can use from a developer point of view, and the test framework from a tester point of view. No one has to use Google. No one has to go off there and find things that are wrong. And there are many, many, many bad examples of atomic accessibility on the web. There's still one of those things that, you know, when it comes to carousels, you cannot actually build a carousel accessibly without JavaScript. It is totally impossible, and actually most carousels aren't even carousels, they're sliders, but they are, or even tabbed interfaces, but you can't do them properly without JavaScript. And you see all of the HTML, they're all breakable. All of them are breakable, all the HTML carousels that are out there. No one's ever cracked it. And so you build all of this stuff. So you've got patterns and you've got practices. Practices are things like typography, color, hiding things that notify you. So, you know, all of those lovely things that are amorphous within WCAG that don't really tell you. If you notice, WCAG doesn't talk about fonts, and fonts are the core of every single reading experience, because fonts are hard. Fonts are something, they'll talk you about to do with a font, but you can have an inaccessible font. And so it doesn't matter what you do with it if you pick the wrong font in the first place. And then there are a load of accessible fonts which aren't accessible. There's a lot of snake oil. They've all got funky names, like hyperlegible. I love that one. If that was British, not American, it would have been rather legible, would have been a bit more accurate. It's not bad. And bionic reading is one of my favorites. Wow, bionic reading. It's absolute tosh. It's the pop-out effect in a font. It doesn't work. It has this, and it's already been tested over time with people, and the effect wears off because your brain gets bored of it. And so you have to deal with it. What do we know? Inclusive design in practices and universal design in patterns. And this is the way that things should be thought about. This is the thing that tells you what to do. I'd wished I'd thought of this 20 years ago. Instead of thinking about compliance, I should have been thinking about people. And this is based on people. So I'll skip past that and that, because we all know. Trigger warning. I am going to do a little bit on fonts. And this guy, this is one of my favorite posters I've ever seen on fonts. It was done by a guy called David Bailey from Designers Republic, who came to work for the BBC for many years, actually, to run the GEL team. And he did this for an exhibition in London, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It's called Two Stupid Faces on One Poster. And there's so much misinformation. This is the other thing I'd wished I'd learned, was never take anything at face value. And you go on the internet and you look at something and someone says, this is accessible. And then you go, brilliant, and go and use it. Always ask why. I want to see the data, which was always our standoff between the BBC and W3C, because they didn't like the BBC having its own guidelines, although we would just say this is for working for and supplying the BBC. We're a public service organisation. Public money is paid for this. We have to make it public. It's part of our openness policy. We're not replacing WCAG. We're just saying this is the way that we do things. And then they would go, passive aggressive, lots of lawyers, all the rest of it. And then what we would say is, brilliant, we'll show you our data because everything that we've got is based on data. You show us your data, we'll sit down and have a look at the data and let the data win. And then when we found out that they didn't have any data. But this is the problem. It started getting me thinking at that point, I need the data behind everything. There's no data to back up Comic Sans as an accessible font. There's no data to back up that dyslexia or open dyslexic actually work with dyslexics. I don't know a single dyslexic person, myself included, that they actually benefit. They think there's a bit of placebo effect that goes on in that, and people expect things, there's primed effect off it, but actually when they're tested, nothing. In fact, the weirdest thing about them is that, well, fonts are really complicated, which is why WCAG doesn't have fonts. There are so many things in fonts that make them complicated. And which is why when you do testing, and this was a study that I was part of with the readability group, I designed this study, and we did 2,500 people. There were nearly 300 people that were dyslexic within it. And this was the results back from the dyslexic group around it. There was 7,000 hours of testing went in this. This was a massive study. And Open Dyslexic, Dyslexia and Comic Sans were the three worst performing fonts for dyslexic people. And the interesting one is that the actual system fonts, SF Pro, San Francisco Pro, Seago UI, Roboto, Verdana were the four highest performing. Absolutely brilliant. It was actually really weird because this virtually mirrored for people with vision impairments as well. And we found out that actually the two lot have the same needs and preferences. Surprise, surprise, they were intersectional. And so you just need to know the needs and preferences around readability and legibility, and it'll support both groups. And this is that, comes back to that whole point. I worked with this chap doing this guy called Bruno Marg. He's retired now, Bruno. He's designed everyone's font. I mean, it's ridiculous how many fonts he's designed. He's also Swiss, and he hates Helvetica. It's a trigger word. It's like hating cuckoos and chocolate and things like that if you're Swiss. He hates, go to the pub with Bruno, just go, Helvetica. You'll get a 10-minute, what, where, hi, and 10 minutes of why it's shit. And he hates it completely. And that's because it's a print font that was taken into the digital world, and it doesn't work with luminosity. It's too tight. He said the problem is it was designed that light reflected from the surface, not light emitted from the surface. So you have a very, very different reading experience. And so we brought Bruno in. Bruno is a huge neuroscience nerd, and he always says that you should never design a font unless you actually understand how a brain reads. And he said, because it's like trying to design build a car and you don't know how cars work. He said, well, how does that happen? You'll just end up with something that Homer Simpson made as a car. That's what you'll end up, and that's what you'll end up with as a font. But he's done Nokia's fonts, Google's, Ubuntu. He did which one of the Olympics did he did? I can't remember, it might have been Rio. He's done Channel 4's, did the BBC's, Ducati, BMW, USA Today. God knows how many others. It's a ridiculous amount of fonts this guy's designed. But every single time he sits, and he has a neuroscientist on his team, and he brings someone in from Imperial College who studies reading. They put people through those big machines that look like donuts, and I can't remember what the hell they're called now. They do brain scans, and they really get into it. And that's why I find him fascinating. But he said to me as well, he said, when we were doing Wreath, he said, we've got to do all of that stuff, but if it does not look like it belongs to a 100-year-old British media organisation that's trying to find a place in a digital world, he said, people will reject it. The organisation will reject it. It won't be relevant emotionally. That is emotional accessibility. You can't just shove something in because of functional. You have to make people will reject if it doesn't sit right, which is why Comic Sans makes everything look like a nursery newsletter, and you should never, ever announce the discovery of the Higgs boson on a PowerPoint slide, a set of PowerPoint slides from CERN in Comic Sans, because the font, the greatest scientific discovery of our age, arguably, the tweets outnumbered it for the font than they did to the discovery on the day, because everyone just took the piss. So you want to be taken seriously, you can't use Comic Sans, because emotional accessibility is a massive problem. I'm just going to end it there. It's fine. But thank you very much for listening to my rant.